Hey guys, tonight we are slipping back into a quieter corner of myth. No flashing lightning, no glittering armor, just one old man with a staff, a grumble, and an extremely long memory. The sun is barely up, the cicadas are still half asleep, and somewhere in the crooked alleys of Thebes, Tiresias is already awake. His hair is wild, his cloak smells faintly of fennel and ash. You probably would not survive 5 minutes in his sandals, mostly because they are uncomfortable and also because people keep asking him things like, "When will I die?" or "Why did my goat fall over?" Or worse, "Does she like me?" So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, I'd love for you to post your location and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day begins with the smell of rosemary and wet stone. Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes, stretches with a creak in each joint and mutters about the weather. He does not need sight to know that it rained in the night. He can feel the damp in the walls, the soft hiss of water still dripping from the eaves. He groans, mostly for effect, and gropes around for his walking stick. He finds it exactly where he left it, leaning against a cracked clay pot filled with dried sage. You shuffle after him as he moves through his narrow home. Shelves hold bundles of herbs, scraps of papyrus, and a few oddly shaped bones he insists are for reading omens. A small snake coils lazily in the corner, blinking at nothing. This is Tiresias's familiar. No one remembers its name, not even the snake. Breakfast is a handful of olives, a piece of bread so dry it could double as roofing tile, and half a cup of something that might be wine, but might also be medicinal vinegar. Tiresias drinks it without complaint. His face does not change. He has had worse. Outside, Thebes is only just waking. Merchants sweep dust from their stalls. A child chases a runaway chicken down the road. Somewhere, someone is already yelling. Tiresias steps outside, sniffs the air, and sighs. Today, someone will come asking about their future. They always do. He never asks how they find him. It is one of those things, like dreams or bee stings or thunder in the distance. You never really escape it. He settles on a stool just outside his door and leans back, letting the sun warm his face. He tilts his head slightly, listening, not for footsteps, but for the way the world hums when it expects something. This morning, the hum is low, almost bored. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greek tradition, Tiresias was considered the greatest of the seers. He was said to have lived for 7 generations, served multiple kings, and spoken with both the living and the dead. Unlike oracles, who received visions from specific gods, Tiresias relied on intuition, wisdom, and a healthy dose of frustration. His fingers brush the worn carvings on his staff. He does not need them to know the wood's texture, but he finds comfort in the rhythm. Today, he thinks, would be a good day not to speak at all. Of course, that is not going to happen. Now for your quirky detail. According to some versions of the myth, Tiresias kept his snakes as companions, not because they were magical, though they were certainly odd, but because he once stepped between a pair of mating snakes and was transformed into a woman. This led to a long and awkward detour in his life story. Historians still argue whether the story is symbolic, cautionary, or simply an elaborate metaphor for how hard it is to mind your own business in ancient Greece. As the morning stretches on, Tiresias listens to the wind rustling through dry olive branches. He does not need sight to know someone is watching him from the far end of the street, probably someone with questions. He sighs again. He could go inside, pretend not to hear, but he knows they will just knock. A moment later, the knock comes, light at first, then slightly more insistent. Tiresias does not move. He lets the silence sit there for a while, like a cup of water waiting to spill. Then, slowly, he stands. He knows the questions already. He always does. Something about love, something about death, something about a missing goat or an ominous dream involving pomegranates. As he steps inside, he mutters to himself. Not words, just a sound. something old, something that could be mistaken for a sigh, or be the beginning of a laugh. You follow him in, past the jars of dried flowers and the heavy air that smells faintly of time and patience. You settle in beside the hearth as the door creaks open again. It begins. Once more. The doorway creaks again, followed by hesitant steps on the stone. Tiresias does not rise this time. He gestures toward a woven mat on the floor and waits. The visitor clears his throat. He is young, probably noble, and entirely too confident for someone who is clearly lost. "I have a question," he says. Tiresias lets the silence stretch long enough for the man to begin doubting the importance of his own words. Eventually, the seer leans forward, reaches for his cup, and takes a deliberate sip. The cup is empty, but the pause serves its purpose. "You do not have a question," Tiresias says. "You have 10. The visitor shifts on the mat. It is about a woman. Tiresias snorts softly. It always is. The man takes a deep breath, then launches into a rambling tale that involves a dream, a missing ring, an upcoming festival, and a worrying that his beloved may or may not be interested in someone who trains racing horses. Tiresias listens to all of it with the expression of a man whose patience is regularly tested but somehow still intact. You sit near the hearth, listening to the words tumble out like a basket of fallen figs. The man wants certainty. He wants reassurance. He wants someone to say, "Yes, she loves you," or "No, your uncle's goat did not curse you." What he gets instead is a long silence and the sound of a spoon clinking against an empty bowl. "You already know the answer," Tiresias says at last. "You just do not like it?" The man hesitates. "So, she does love me." Tiresias sighs through his nose. "No." The silence that follows is sharp and immediate. The man swallows, nods slowly, and rises without a word. As he reaches the door, Tiresias adds, "But she might have, if you had asked a better question." Here is your mainstream historical fact. Seers in ancient Greece were not simply prediction machines. They were often philosophers, counselors, and reluctant participants in the emotional dramas of the people around them. Tiresias in particular was known for his bluntness and his tendency to give answers that were technically correct, though not always comforting. After the visitor leaves, Tiresias leans back in his seat. He scratches the back of his neck, mutters something about needing better cushions, and motions toward the snake curled near the hearth. The snake blinks slowly, unimpressed. "Now for your quirky detail." It was said Tiresias once refused to answer a king's question until the man brought him a basket of figs and promised not to cry at the answer. The figs were delivered. The king cried anyway. Historians still argue whether the story reveals more about Tiresias or about the fragility of the people who demanded truth. Outside, the sun has climbed just above the rooftops. Thebes hums with life. A fish seller shouts across the square. A woman drops a clay pot and curses the gods. Tiresias listens to all of it like it is a song he has heard too many times, but still hums along with. He pulls a scroll from a nearby shelf and opens it, though he cannot read it. The motion is habit. His fingers move across the parchment, tracing the ridges and folds. You wonder if he actually remembers what it says, or if he is simply letting his hands remind him that time passes, even when no one wants it to. Another knock at the door. This one is softer. Tiresias says nothing. The door opens anyway. A girl steps in, maybe 12 years old. She carries a small jar of honey and places it on the table without speaking. Her eyes are wide. Her shoulders are tense. She says she dreamed of snakes. Tiresias smiles. "Did they speak to you?" She nods. "They asked for my shoes." He considers that for a moment. "Did you give them?" "No." "Good." The girl blinks. "Why?" "Because they have no feet." The girl frowns, then laughs. It is a small, bright sound that floats up like steam. Tiresias tells her to pour the honey into the bowl by the fire. Then he asks what else happened in the dream. She says she saw a tree grow from her chest, full of figs and bees and birds that sang like flutes. Tiresias nods along, listening with real interest. He asks questions. He does not interrupt. He lets her speak until the words run dry. Then he tells her, softly, that she is ready to begin asking questions of her own. She beams. He does not tell her what the dream means. That, he says, is the beginning of a very long and occasionally irritating journey. She leaves with lighter steps than when she arrived. You sit with Tiresias as he pours the warm honey into a second bowl and offers you some bread. It is better than the dry crust from earlier. A touch of sweetness makes all the difference. Outside, the city moves on. Inside, Tiresias closes his eyes and listens to nothing for a while. You begin to understand that for someone who sees everything without eyes, quiet may be the closest thing to peace. The sunlight creeps across the floor in slow, golden strips, and Tiresias finally shifts from his stool with a grunt. He mutters something about his knees, something about figs, and something about the dangers of too much sitting. He stretches one arm, then the other, and makes his way toward the rear of the house. You follow, past the table cluttered with bowls and scrolls, past a bundle of dry herbs that smells faintly of mint and dust. He opens a wooden chest, leans down, and pulls out a long cloak of deep purple. It is wrinkled and has a stain near the hem that might be pomegranate or old wine. He holds it up, shrugs, and throws it over his shoulders with the flair of someone who once understood fashion and still remembers just enough to pretend. You ask where he is going. He taps his staff on the floor twice and says, "To remember." You are not sure what that means until he leads you down a narrow alley, past sun-warmed walls and startled cats, toward a grove just outside the city. The trees here are old and bent, the grass soft and spotted with fallen leaves. Tiresias walks slowly, but each step seems measured, deliberate. He stops at a particular clearing, quiet and unremarkable, except for the way he turns his head slightly, as if listening to something no one else can hear. "This is where it happened," he says. You wait. He crouches carefully, fingers brushing the grass. "The snakes were fighting. I stepped between them." You blink. Oh, that memory. Here is your mainstream historical fact. One of the most famous myths about Tiresias tells how he came upon two snakes mating and struck them with a stick. Depending on the version, he either killed them, separated them, or simply startled them. As a result, he was transformed into a woman. He lived that way for 7 years before another encounter with snakes changed him back. Tiresias smiles faintly. Being a woman was not so bad, he says, though the sandals were ridiculous. He straightens with effort, brushes off his cloak, and begins walking again. The gods found it amusing. For them, everything is amusing, especially when it happens to someone else. Now for your quirky detail. Some ancient accounts say Tiresias was not only changed into a woman, but also married, had children, and lived an entirely different life during those years. There are even claims that she served as a priestess in the temple to Hera and gave birth to a daughter who later became a famous singer. Historians still argue whether this tale was meant to be allegorical or simply the product of a very imaginative dinner party. You continue through the grove. Tiresias runs his hand along the bark of a tree, nods, and says something in a language you do not recognize. Then he turns and says, "They never asked how I felt about it, just what I learned." You sit with him under the tree. He leans against the trunk and lets the sunlight warm his feet. The sounds of the city are distant now. The grove holds its own quiet. "I learned what they wanted," he says at last. What both sides wanted to hear. You ask what that was. He lifts an eyebrow. That they were right. The breeze shifts. A bird calls from the upper branches. Tiresias tilts his head. They never listen to the whole answer, only the part that flatters them. You ask if he ever missed that other life. He considers. Not really. But sometimes I remember the way my voice changed, the way people listened differently, the way certain things became easier, and others became impossible. The quiet stretches again. Not heavy, not sad, just full. He taps his staff against the ground and adds, "The strangest part was how little the gods understood about any of it." You almost laugh, but he is not joking. "They are powerful," he says, "but they do not understand us. Not really. Not the mess, not the longing, not the soup." You ask about the soup. Tiresias smiles. "It is always about the soup. Warm enough to comfort, thick enough to fill, never quite enough salt." As the sun begins to lower, he rises again. The walk back is slow. The path feels familiar now, worn not just by feet, but by thought. Back at the house, he removes the cloak and folds it with surprising care. He places it in the chest again, closes the lid, and sighs. You settle near the fire as he pours himself a bowl of lentils and sips it without speaking. He does not say whether he liked being a woman. He does not say whether he liked being a man. He just eats his soup and listens to the quiet, the way only someone who has been both can do. You barely finish tidying the bowls before there's a sharp knock at the door. Tiresias doesn't move. He doesn't ask who it is. He just lets out a long breath that seems to carry a decade of weariness and mutters, "It's them again." You sit back down as the door creaks open. A breeze carries in the scent of olive oil, anger, and something faintly floral. And then you hear it. The booming voice of Zeus, deep, dramatic, and far too loud for a room this small. Behind him, Hera enters without speaking. She is already glaring, her arms folded, her sandals spotless. Tiresias raises an eyebrow, not because he can see, but because it's the only facial muscle that hasn't given up on expressing disapproval. "You will settle this," Zeus says. Now, Tiresias does not even ask what the argument is about. He already knows. They have had this fight before. It's about who experiences more pleasure, men or women. Why they care so deeply about this remains a mystery no oracle has ever been able to solve. Zeus gestures wildly. Hera looks like she's chewing a lemon. Tiresias leans his head back against the wall and sighs again. "They picked you," Hera says, her voice sharp. "You are the only one who has lived both lives." Tiresias does not reply immediately. He pours himself a cup of water and takes a slow sip. Then, without looking up, he says, "Women." Zeus beams. Hera's eyebrows vanish into her hairline. The silence that follows is brittle and full of cracks. "By how much?" Zeus asks eagerly. Tiresias shrugs. 9 parts out of 10. Hera turns, leaves, and slams the door so hard a jar falls off a shelf. Zeus laughs all the way into the street, where his laughter turns into thunder. The rain begins almost immediately. Here is your mainstream historical fact. One of the most famous myths about Tiresias tells how he was called upon by Zeus and Hera to settle a long-standing argument. Since Tiresias had lived as both a man and a woman, he was considered uniquely qualified to judge. His answer, favoring women, angered Hera so much that she struck him blind. As compensation, Zeus granted him the gift of prophecy. Tiresias, now slightly damp from the sudden downpour, picks up the fallen jar, sets it back on the shelf, and mutters something under his breath that sounds like a curse, but also might be a soup recipe. You decide not to ask. He sits back down, his fingers tapping the edge of his staff. Now for your quirky detail. Some stories say Hera did not just blind Tiresias. She also made sure he never forgot how inconvenient it was to be right. For years afterward, his dreams were filled with arguments, sandals that pinched, and long walks to temples where no one paid him. Historians still argue whether these details were added later to give Hera more personality or to make the story slightly more entertaining at dinner parties. Outside, the rain pounds the roof. Tiresias listens to it as if it is speaking directly to him. Maybe it is. You have begun to suspect that even the weather answers his questions before he asks. He speaks again, more to the room than to you. They always come asking for truth. Then they punish you for saying it. You nod. Being right, he continues, is the loneliest thing in the world. The snake hisses softly from the corner. Tiresias chuckles. Except for snakes. They seem to enjoy it. You spend the rest of the afternoon in quiet. Tiresias doesn't speak much more, but the room feels full anyway, full of old voices, unsaid things, and arguments that never seem to end. As the rain finally stops, a soft breeze pushes through the shutters. The air smells clean again. Tiresias closes his eyes and leans his head back. You think he might be sleeping, until he speaks. She did not blind me because I was wrong. She blinded me because I was too calm when I said it. You let the thoughts settle. The fire crackles softly. The jar on the shelf wobbles slightly, but stays in place. The storm passes. The silence returns. And Tiresias, with nothing more to prove, drifts into a nap so deep it might be mistaken for prophecy. The rain leaves behind a city rinsed and glistening. Puddles dot the stone paths like bits of sky fallen to the ground. You step over one on your way to fetch kindling, but Tiresias has already beaten you to it. He stands barefoot outside, robe tucked under one arm, poking the base of a fig tree with his staff. I told them not to plant this here, he mutters. The roots always know when someone has lied nearby. You do not ask how he knows it was a lie. He reaches down, picks up a fallen fig, and turns it over in his hands. Soft in the wrong places, he says, just like Oedipus. You blink. It is not the name you expected to hear over breakfast. Tiresias tosses the fig to a passing goat, who chews it thoughtfully and walks off. Inside, a few villagers have gathered at the edge of the courtyard. They are quiet. They are waiting. One of them is a messenger. The others are hangers-on, the kind who hover near prophecy like ants near honey, hoping for a drop of wisdom. Tiresias sighs. Oedipus wants answers. You feel the weight of the name. You have heard the rumors. A king with too many questions. A city with too many dead. And a man who once saved Thebes from a riddle now struggling to understand his own life. He is going to be dramatic, Tiresias says flatly. And he is right. By midday, Oedipus has arrived. Crown tilted, tunic perfectly folded, eyes sharp with suspicion. He does not bow. He does not smile. He demands. Tiresias listens. He does not speak. The king paces. The king shouts. The villagers watch from a safe distance, pretending to be neutral and failing completely. When Oedipus finally pauses, Tiresias tilts his head and says nothing. The silence stretches until even the birds fall quiet. I will have the truth, Oedipus snaps. Tiresias replies, you already do. That is why you are angry. Oedipus clenches his fists. Speak plainly, old man. You killed your father. You married your mother. And you still think asking the question was the mistake. Oedipus turns pale. The villagers gasp. One of them drops a clay cup. It shatters like the last illusion of a happy ending. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, Tiresias is the first to speak the terrible truth. Oedipus, desperate to find the source of a plague afflicting Thebes, summons the seer and demands an answer. Tiresias resists, then tells him that he is the cause of the city's suffering. Oedipus refuses to believe him. He accuses Tiresias of conspiracy. Only later, when the truth becomes undeniable, does Oedipus see that the old man was right all along. Oedipus storms off, robes billowing, fury crackling in his wake. Tiresias leans back in his seat and says, that went better than last time. You ask how many times this has happened. He shrugs. Enough that I stopped keeping track. They always come. They always rage. They always leave. Now for your quirky detail. One lesser-known version of the myth claims Tiresias cursed the ground he stood on during his first argument with Oedipus, and to this day, nothing grows in that particular patch of earth. A scholar once tried to dig up the soil to prove it. The shovel broke. Historians still argue whether this was divine wrath or just very stubborn clay. Tiresias stands, stretches, and dusts off his robe. Prophecy, he says, is just remembering something that has not happened yet. You think about that while helping him sweep the courtyard. The breeze is light. The sky is finally clear. The fig tree watches silently. The rest of the day passes without much drama. A neighbor brings lentils. A boy asks about a dream involving bees and broken sandals. Tiresias says it means nothing and to stop eating cheese before bed. That evening, you help him light a lamp. He sits with his cup of wine, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. You know, he says, the hardest part is not seeing what will happen. It is watching them beg for the truth and then throw it away. You ask if that ever gets easier. He smiles, but it does not reach his eyes. No, but the soup helps. You nod. The fire pops. The fig tree sways. And somewhere in the distance, a king weeps for something he asks to know. Morning arrives with no wine and too much brightness. Tiresias is already awake. He sits cross-legged near the door with a handful of olives and a flat piece of bread that crackles with each bite. His snake coils lazily in a patch of sunlight, uninterested in both the olives and the conversations to come. You pour him a little water. He nods in thanks. Then he taps his staff twice on the floor. They will come again today, he says, not with dread, but with the tone of someone resigned to the noise of it all. You ask who he means. He smiles faintly. Anyone, everyone. People always want the truth, right until they hear it. By late morning, the first visitor arrives. A man with too many rings and not enough patience. He wants to know if his fortune will change, if his new investment, olive oil, if you're curious, will prosper. Tiresias tilts his head. You want me to tell you what you already suspect, he says. It will not. The man insists. Tiresias gives him the same answer, now with fewer words. The man leaves fuming, muttering about frauds and poor customer service. You are still thinking about that phrase, what you already suspect. Another visitor, a woman this time, middle-aged, tired, but holding herself up right like a statue someone forgot to finish carving. She wants to know whether her daughter will ever speak to her again. Tiresias says, yes. The woman looks relieved. Then he adds, but not in the way you hope. She looks away. Then she nods, slowly, leaves without speaking. She understood. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Tiresias appears in many Greek tragedies and epics as the reluctant messenger. He never seeks out power or status. He simply speaks what he knows. In each case, he is met with disbelief or hostility, even when proven right. His role is not to comfort, but to clarify. You ask him why he never lies. It would be easier. He shrugs. Because then I would be like them. Now for your quirky detail. In one lesser-told legend, Tiresias once gave deliberately vague advice to a goat herder just to see if anyone noticed. The herder misinterpreted it and invented a new festival. It caught on. Historians still argue whether this is true or simply a story created by future oracles who also enjoyed a break now and then. By midday, Tiresias has already spoken to 5 more people. One wants to know whether he should marry his cousin. Tiresias says, no, before the man finished the question. Another asks about a wine shipment. Another wants to know if her husband is lying. Tiresias just raises an eyebrow. They never want my answer. He tells you later. Just my blessing. You nod. He walks to the edge of the garden, runs his fingers along a row of dry thyme. They think blindness means I see something more, he says. But it is the same world, just less distracting. A neighbor stops by with a bowl of soup, lentils and something green. Tiresias thanks her. They talk briefly about the weather. She does not ask for a prophecy. She just leaves the bowl, says to return it, whenever. He smiles at that. Later, you sit with him near the fire. The air smells of herbs and warm stone. The snake is now curled around a clay jar, looking vaguely smug. Tiresias leans back in his chair, eyes closed. Do you know what happens when people hear the truth? You wait. They argue with it. Then they ignore it. Then they say they knew it all along. You ask if that makes him angry. No, he says. But it does make the soup taste better. Outside, a soft breeze lifts a few fallen leaves. The sun has begun to sink, casting long, lazy shadows across the floor. Tiresias doesn't speak again for a while. He lets the quiet settle. Then, after a few more sips, he adds, being blind was never the punishment. It was the excuse. You do not ask for an explanation. He would not give one anyway. The fire crackles. The snake shifts. You sit beside a man who sees everything and still chooses silence more often than speech. The visitors will come again tomorrow. They always do. But tonight, there is no need for answers. Only warmth, quiet, and the faint scent of time. The morning comes with a dry wind that sweeps dust down the streets and makes the shutters rattle. Tiresias does not flinch. He simply pulls his cloak tighter around his shoulders and sits near the threshold of his home, tapping a rhythm on the stone with his staff. It is not a complicated rhythm, but it has weight. You suspect he is speaking without speaking again. A few neighbors shuffle by and nod. No one interrupts. Everyone seems to know that today is not a day for cheerful greetings or unnecessary questions. Tiresias's face is a little more closed than usual. His mouth is set in a line that says he has been remembering things he would rather not. Eventually, you ask what it is. He does not look up. He just says, "Petty gods, worse mortals." You wait. That usually means a story is coming, whether he wants to tell it or not. "They were shouting again," he says. "The gods. They wake the dead with their arguing." He leans back slightly, tilting his head toward the sky. "They never stop, always measuring, comparing, punishing, praising, like children with temples instead of toys." You offer him a fig, which he accepts without thanks. He chews slowly, lost in thought. "The problem," he says, "is that mortals want to be gods, and the gods want to be mortals, but neither wants to admit it." You smile. "That sounds about right." Here is your mainstream historical fact. In Greek myth, the gods are not omnipotent in the way later religions portray their deities. They have flaws. They argue, fall in love, seek revenge, and play favorites. Their interactions with mortals are full of emotion and mischief, often causing more harm than help. Tiresias, who spans both divine and mortal realms, is frequently caught in the middle. He tells you about a time when two gods argued over a song. Apollo claimed the lyre was the finest instrument. Pan insisted it was the pipes. They asked a mortal to judge. That mortal picked Pan. Apollo, furious, gave him donkey ears. And that, Tiresias says, is why I do not judge music contests. You laugh, then pause. He is not smiling. Now for your quirky detail. Some stories claim that Tiresias was once invited to Olympus itself, but declined the offer, saying the air was too clean and the gods too loud. Instead, he sent a message written on fig bark that read, "Try listening for once." Historians still argue whether this event ever happened, or if it is simply a tale the people of Thebes told each other when the gods seemed particularly moody. Tiresias runs his hand along the worn wood of his staff. They ask for praise. Always praise, even when they've done nothing. You ask if the gods fear anything. He nods. Obscurity. The way he says it makes you think he knows what that feels like too. You sit together for a while, watching the dust roll along the road like tiny tumbleweeds. A rooster crows in the distance. Someone drops a jug. The world continues, unaware of the conversations that swirl inside Tiresias' mind. He stands with effort and walks to the small altar in the corner of the courtyard. There is a clay bowl filled with water, a few withered herbs, and the stub of a beeswax candle. He lights it, not as an offering, but as a warning. The flame wobbles in the wind. They will come, he says. They always do, and when they do, they will ask for mercy from the same gods they cursed yesterday. You wonder aloud if the gods listen. Sometimes, he replies, but usually only when it is entertaining. The wind picks up, scattering olive leaves across the floor. The candle flickers, then steadies. You pour 2 cups of water, one for yourself, one for him. He raises his in a quiet toast and says, "To the mortals, and to the gods they blame." The rest of the day passes quietly. No visitors, no questions, just the sound of wine and memory. As the sun begins to dip, casting long shadows over the stone floor, Tiresias turns his face toward the fading light. He does not speak again for the rest of the evening. He simply listens, and for a moment, you are certain he hears things that are not there. Not yet. The morning air smells of dust and laurel, and the sky has that strange brightness that comes just before the heat settles in. Tiresias steps outside, barefoot, cloak dragging a little behind him. His fingers trail along the wall as he makes his way toward the edge of the street. You follow, quiet. He does not speak for a long while. Then, with no warning, he says, "Have you ever seen someone fall in love with their own reflection?" You pause. You are not sure if this is a trick question or the start of a myth. With Tiresias, it is often both. He turns his head slightly, as if listening to some long-lost voice. "There was a boy," he says. "Beautiful, not just in the way people say it to be kind. Truly beautiful. Enough to make you forget your words." You sit down beside him on the warm stones. He doesn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he simply expects you to be there now. He had so many admirers, Tiresias continues, and not a bit of interest in any of them. Not cruel, not proud, just detached, like love was a language he had never learned. You ask for the boy's name, though you already suspect. Narcissus, he says softly. He looked at people like they were a question he had already answered. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greek mythology, Narcissus was a youth of extraordinary beauty who rejected all romantic advances. According to Ovid's telling, he was cursed to fall in love with his own reflection after spurning the nymph Echo. Captivated by the image in a pool of water, he eventually wasted away, unable to leave it. Tiresias leans back against the wall, eyes closed. They asked me what would happen to him, he says. I told them, if he does not know himself, he will not live long. He chuckles. That was taken as a riddle. Everything I say becomes a riddle when no one wants to understand. You ask what Narcissus was really like. Tiresias smiles. Tired. Always tired. As if being looked at drained him. He goes on. How people followed Narcissus wherever he walked. How they sighed and whispered and tripped over themselves trying to be noticed. How Narcissus said little, kept to himself, and spent hours near the stream, not admiring himself. Tiresias says, just listening to the water. It was the only thing that didn't speak back. Now for your quirky detail. One lesser-known version of the myth suggests that Narcissus wasn't just enchanted by his own beauty, but that he saw in his reflection something more, an ideal, perhaps, or a moment of calm he couldn't find anywhere else. Some even say he mistook the reflection for another person entirely. Historians still argue whether this reading turns the story from a warning about vanity into a tale of deep loneliness. Tiresias rubs the back of his neck and sighs. The real tragedy is that he died staring at himself. It was that no one saw the boy beyond the face. You look toward the trees. The wind rustles the leaves softly. The air is warm, but not uncomfortable. He did not need to be loved. Tiresias says he needed to be left alone, but mortals never understand that. A bird calls nearby. The city stirs in the distance. Markets and gossip waking up again. Tiresias does not move. They brought me his body, he says quietly. Asks what should be done. I told them to plant flowers. Not because it was fitting, but because it was simple. You ask if he knew Echo. He nods. She loved words too much, and then she lost them. That was her punishment. Loving too loudly, you wait. But he does not continue. Some stories end that way. Not with a lesson, just with a long silence and something unsaid. Later, as you walk back to the house together, he taps the ground thoughtfully with his staff. They always remember the face, he says. They never remember the silence. You wonder if that is his way of asking to be remembered differently too. The day drifts slowly toward its warm middle. Shadows shrink. The air stills. Even the birds seem to pause between songs. Tiresias, sitting in the shade of the old olive tree near his doorway, gently rolls a smooth stone between his palms. You ask what it is? He shrugs. Something Echo gave me, he says. Or maybe I found it after she left. I cannot recall. You settle beside him as he begins to speak again, voice quieter this time. She loved him, you know, Narcissus. But it was the kind of love that cannot land anywhere. It just floats. He closes his eyes and smiles faintly, as if remembering something sweet and ridiculous. She talked too much, Echo did. Gods punished her for that. Said she could only repeat the last thing she heard. You ask why that was considered punishment. Tiresias nods thoughtfully, because they wanted her to listen, not respond. But she never learned that kind of silence. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In classical myth, Echo was a mountain nymph who was cursed by Hera to only repeat the last words spoken to her. This came after Echo distracted Hera with conversation to help Zeus escape a romantic situation. When Echo later fell in love with Narcissus, she could not express her feelings in her own voice. Instead, she simply echoed him, unable to initiate or explain. She followed him, Tiresias says, through fields, forests, over rivers, always one step behind, always whispering him back to himself. You ask if they ever spoke. Tiresias smiles sadly. Not truly, he said. Who's there? And she said, there, he said. Leave me, and she said, leave me. Every word a door that would not open. Now for your quirky detail. Some obscure poems claim that Echo eventually forgot her own voice completely. Over time, her words lost meaning and became only sound. One myth suggests that she did not fade away into rock, but into rhythm, becoming part of the wind that moves through trees and caves. Historians still argue whether this transformation symbolizes unrequited love or the erosion of self through silence. Tiresias runs his thumb along the smooth edge of the stone. She watched him die, he says, watched him lean closer and closer into the water, hoping to be touched. You wonder what happened to her afterward. She stayed, he says, not out of hope, out of habit. The silence that follows feels long but not empty. You hear the rustle of fig leaves, the slow creak of a cart in the distance. The world continues while Echo fades into air and memory. Tiresias tilts his head. She was never meant for quiet, but the gods do not like voices they cannot control. You ask if Echo ever loved anyone else. Maybe, he replies, but no one noticed, not even her. He reaches for a cup of water, sips it slowly. I told them both, long before it happened. I said, you cannot love a reflection, and you cannot be loved if no one hears your words. They both ignored me. Of course, that is the tradition. You ask why he still gives advice, knowing it will not be followed. He shrugs, because sometimes they remember after it is too late. And even that is worth something. The sun shifts slightly, casting new shadows across the stone path. The snake near the doorway lifts its head, flicks its tongue, then settles again. Tiresias places the stone gently beside a small clay jar and stands. Come, he says, I want to feel the wine on the hill. You walk with him through the dry grass, the sun at your back, the soft whisper of wind just beginning to rise. You hear something else, too, faint, like a breath, like someone repeating your last word, just to keep you company. The hill is not high, but it rises just enough to give you a view of the rooftops, the olive groves, and the faint blue line of the river in the distance. Tiresias walks slowly, his staff tapping the ground in a steady rhythm. He does not speak at first, and you do not interrupt. His silence is rarely empty. It usually means he is turning something over in his mind, like a stone being rolled smooth by time. You sit together on a patch of dry grass near a crooked fig tree. The sky above is cloudless. The warmth of the sun rests gently on your shoulders. Tiresias lets out a long sigh and says, you know, I have not seen a tunic that fits properly in years. You blink. That is not what you were expecting. He smirks. One of the perks of being blind. I can pretend not to notice the ridiculous things people wear. You chuckle, and he tilts his head slightly. It is true. There is a boy in the market who wears a belt as a headband. Says it makes him look taller. He chuckles to himself, then shifts into a more serious tone. But blindness it does offer more than fashion immunity. It grants freedom. No distractions. No flattery. No pretending you do not see what you see. You ask if he misses it. Sight. He considers. At first, yes. The colors, the faces, the little details. But then I learned to see through other means. A voice tells you far more than a face ever does. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In Greek myth, after being blinded by Hera for revealing the truth about the pleasures of men and women, Tiresias was compensated by Zeus with the gift of prophecy and an extraordinarily long life. Some accounts say he was given the ability to understand birdsong, to hear omens in the wind, and to speak with the dead. He leans back on his hands, face turned up toward the sun. They thought taking my sight would stop me from seeing, but they misunderstood what I see. You glance over. He looks perfectly content. His feet stretch out into the grass. His sandals are older than most ruins, but still serviceable. Now for your quirky detail. One story claims Tiresias once gave fashion advice to a queen purely based on the sound her bracelets made. She had entered the room in a swirl of clinking bronze, and he had said, "That is too much for someone not at war." Historians still argue whether this happened or if it was a clever addition by someone who wanted to turn him into a style icon. Tiresias taps his fingers against his knee. The thing no one realizes, he says, is that blindness does not make you wise. It makes you quiet. And in the quiet, if you are lucky, You might learn something. You ask what the quiet teaches. He smiles. That people speak the loudest when they are afraid. You sit with that thought a moment. The wind shifts slightly. A few dry leaves skitter across the grass. He points toward the road, though he cannot see it. There goes someone running from their future, probably to ask someone else for what I have already told them. You ask why they do not listen. He shrugs. Because listening requires stillness, and stillness feels like death to most people. The sun slips a little lower in the sky. The air cools slightly. Tiresias hums something low and tuneless, a melody without shape. You ask if he ever wished for something else, a different life, a simpler one. He thinks for a long time before answering. Sometimes I imagine being a baker, waking before dawn, kneading dough, the smell of yeast and flour. No one asking about fate, just bread. You smile at the image. Tiresias, in a flour-dusted robe, muttering about oven temperatures. But even then, he says, someone would come in and ask me if their husband was cheating. You both laugh. The wind picks up again. The leaves rustle softly. Below, the city continues its slow rhythm of trade and talk, gossip and sandals clapping on stone. Tiresias stands with effort. Come on, the soup will burn if we stay too long. You help him up. He rests a hand on your shoulder for balance, then taps the path gently with his staff. Blindness, he says one last time, was not the end of my sight. It was the beginning of everyone else's noise, and together, you walk back down the hill, the world unfolding gently beneath your feet. The sun dips low as you and Tiresias return to the small house with the fig tree out front and the cracked jars stacked near the door. He moves more slowly now, leaning heavily on his staff, the long walk making him quieter than usual. But once you are inside, he lifts his head, sniffing the air. Birds, he says. Someone has been sending birds again. You pause with the kettle halfway to the fire. Birds. He nods. Someone is trying to get my attention by releasing doves into the courtyard. It's a message. Or maybe they think it's romantic. Either way, the birds are always confused, and they always poop on the stones. You peer outside. Sure enough, 3 small doves sit on the low wall near the gate, staring blankly, as if wondering what comes next. One flutters off toward the fig tree. The others remain unimpressed. They think birds bring wisdom, Tiresias says, easing down onto his seat. Some of them even believe you can understand prophecy by watching the way a raven lands, or how an owl blinks. I tried that once. The owl just stared at me. We had a moment. I did not enjoy it. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In many ancient cultures, birds were believed to carry divine messages. The practice of interpreting bird movements, called augury, was particularly strong in Rome, but had roots in older Greek traditions. Prophets and seers would watch the flight of birds, their direction, their cries, and their behavior to interpret the will of the gods. Tiresias shakes his head and chuckles. One man asked me once why a pigeon had flown into his house. I said maybe it liked his curtains. He said I lacked imagination. You smile and serve him a small bowl of lentils. The doves continue their lazy fluttering just outside the door. One begins pecking at a fig, then stops, seemingly unsure whether it is worth the effort. Now for your quirky detail. A rare version of a myth claims that Tiresias once spoke with a sparrow who had been trained to say short phrases. The bird flew into his house and said, "Your neighbor is cheating at dice." Tiresias told the man who owned the bird that if it spoke again, he would feed it to a cat. The bird never returned. Historians still argue whether this tale, an invention from later satire, or if someone truly attempted to use trained birds for petty messages. You ask whether he ever uses birds himself. He snorts. No, too messy, and I do not trust anything that can fly but chooses to waddle. He spoons lentils slowly, pausing between bites. The real question is not what the birds say. It's why mortals think someone is always trying to send them signs. You think about that. The need to feel chosen. The desire to make sense of random flutterings. It all begins to feel very familiar. People want meaning. Tiresias says, even in feathers. The snake stirs from its place near the fire, stretches slowly, and coils into a tighter loop. Tiresias reaches out and taps the clay jar beside him. They ask if the gods speak through wind, through leaves, through birds. They never ask if the gods speak through silence. You ask what silence would say. He leans back, expression softening. Probably something like, "You already know. Stop asking." You watch the last of the sun's light slide across the floor. The doves have taken flight, heading east. Maybe they were delivering a message after all. Or, they just remembered a better tree. Tiresias sets down his bowl, folds his hands in his lap, and listens. Not to anything in particular, just to the hum of the house, the soft settling of wood, the far-off sound of someone sweeping a courtyard. They keep asking, he says. What does the owl mean? What does the crow mean? I tell them, it means the owl is hunting and the crow is watching. He chuckles again. But they want poetry. You ask if there is any harm in that. No, he replies. As long as they know it is poetry. The fire crackles. The breeze slips through the doorway. The fig tree sways, as if trying to echo the rhythm of the dove's departure. And Tiresias, content for now, says nothing more. The city hums a little louder today. From the doorway, you can hear a marketplace argument echoing across the square, something about spoiled olives and who truly owns which donkey. Tiresias winces. Ah, Thebes, he murmurs, home of drama that never ends and questions that never needed asking. You help him prepare for the day by scooping out the hearth and brushing a few fig leaves off the stoop. A small clay cup has cracked overnight, likely from the cool air. He picks it up, fingers brushing the break as though reading a page. Another sign. You ask, teasing gently. He tilts his head, a sign that someone needs to stop stacking these so close to the fire. By mid-morning, they begin to arrive. The curious, the anxious, the clearly bored. Tiresias greets none of them warmly, but none of them leave. A man in his 40s speaks first. He wants to know why his goats are restless. Tiresias replies that goats are always restless, especially when bored, and perhaps they are reflecting their owner's nature. The man frowns. Tiresias does not soften it. Next, a young woman asks about marriage, not her own, but her sister's. Tiresias listens with a blank expression, then says, if she cries while weaving, the answer is no. The woman nods as if that settles everything. Soon there is a small group gathered, a chorus of groans, questions, and sandals scuffing the stone. They bring the usual blend of petty concerns, half-truths, and overly detailed dreams involving animals, broken pottery, and misplaced teeth. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece, seers and oracles were consulted regularly for everything from major political decisions to mundane household questions. Prophets like Tiresias served as both spiritual advisors and emotional sponges, absorbing the worries of their communities in exchange for food, gifts, or begrudging respect. Tiresias leans on his staff, one foot tucked under the bench. They never ask what they should do, he says to you softly, only what will happen. A man steps forward and asks if he should sail tomorrow. Tiresias frowns. You cannot swim, he says. The man blinks. How do you know? Tiresias smiles. Because you hesitated. Now for your quirky detail. Some say Tiresias once issued a prophecy for an entire neighborhood by sniffing the wind and declaring, someone's stew will burn tonight, and 3 men will lie to their wives. Reportedly, a pot did burn, and exactly 3 arguments occurred before nightfall. Historians still argue whether this was foresight or an educated guess based on the way people were holding their spoons. The crowd grows thicker, drawn more by the atmosphere than the answers. It feels like a performance. One woman weeps softly into her scarf. A boy rolls a pebble along the wall. A merchant offers Tiresias a dried fig in exchange for a blessing. He accepts the fig and eats it slowly. You do not need a blessing, he says with his mouth full. You need better sandals. The merchant looks at his feet and blushes. Tiresias shifts in his seat. The noise tires him, but he does not ask them to leave. He knows they need this, even if he does not. You ask why he tolerates the constant buzz of whirring. Because, he says, this is how mortals pray now, out loud. Without realizing, he sighs. gestures to the group. They all want to be seen, not by the gods, by each other. The snake slithers from the corner to curl under the bench. One child yelps. Tiresias chuckles. Even the snake is wiser than half of them, he says, then adds, but also less polite. As the sun climbs higher, the crowd begins to disperse. Some leave with furrowed brows. Others look oddly lighter, as if just being heard was enough. You sweep the dust away from the doorway once more. Tiresias leans back, rubbing his temples. They think I hold the answers, he says, but I only hold the mirror. You nod, unsure if that's meant for you or for the fig tree that stands. Once again, in full silence, the house settles into stillness, and for the moment, even Thebes holds its breath. The air cools as afternoon leans into early evening. The streets quiet just slightly, as if Thebes is finally pausing for breath. You find Tiresias in the courtyard again, sitting beside a jar of olives and poking at them like they have done him personal harm. I have seen this tragedy before, he says, almost to himself. The faces change, the tunics get longer or shorter, but the drama, always the same. You sit down nearby. His voice is softer today, not tired exactly, but folded inward, like someone turning over the same stone in his mind for the 10th time. They arrive crying. They demand truth. They rip their clothes. They shout to the sky. But then they keep walking straight into the same mess. He sighs. Thebes is a fine city for weaving, terrible for learning from mistakes. He reaches for one of the olives, examines it, then puts it back in the jar with a grimace. Too salty, like most royal families. You smirk. He continues. One time, I told a man he would lose everything if he entered that door. He looked me in the face, thanked me, and then opened the door. You ask what happened. He lost everything, except his sandals. I think he still wears them. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In many plays and legends, Tiresias is portrayed as the one figure who knows the truth from the beginning, but is ignored or dismissed. In Antigone, in the Bacchae, in Oedipus Rex, it is Tiresias who speaks calmly, clearly, and early. The other characters always refuse to listen until it is too late. They wait until the third act, he mutters, until the chorus begins wailing and the urns are knocked over, before they think, maybe that old man was onto something. Now for your quirky detail. A lesser-known tradition claims Tiresias once appeared in a play written by a hopeful playwright who had never met him. Tiresias attended the performance in secret, then approached the man afterward and simply said, "You gave me better sandals. Thank you." Historians still argue whether this meeting ever occurred or if the playwright invented the encounter to add gravitas to his failing script. You ask what it feels like, seeing the same patterns repeat. Like sitting through a play you already memorized, but the actors keep forgetting their lines. He shifts on the bench, stretching one leg out before him. I once tried to warn a man that his son would cause his downfall. He said, "Which son?" I said, "Does it matter?" He said, "Well, it helps to narrow it down." You laugh. He does not. I warned a woman that her ambition would destroy her family. She said, "So I should stop." I said, "That would help." She said, "I'll think about it." Then she walked off and commissioned a statue of herself. He plucks a fig from the tree and rolls it between his palms. They think I predict disaster because I enjoy it. But I just read the patterns. I can't help that the pattern always ends in someone tearing a tunic and collapsing near an altar. He tosses the fig over his shoulder. It bounces once, then rolls quietly under a bench. You watch the light shift across the courtyard tiles. He speaks again, quieter now. The worst part isn't when they don't listen. It's when they do. And it still happens. You do not ask him to explain. The silence says more. A soft breeze moves through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of olives, dust, and someone's roasting barley down the street. Tiresias tilts his face toward it. "You know what the chorus never asks," he says. "How I feel when I'm right." You ask him now. He pauses, then shrugs, like I'm standing in a collapsing house, holding the blueprint. The sun slips below the rooftops. The sky darkens, gently, like a curtain falling at the end of another performance. Tiresias stands with effort and begins moving toward the house. Come, he says, let the city finish its tragedy without us for once. And together, you leave the courtyard behind. The moon is barely a sliver tonight, like a thin line scratched across the sky by a half-interested god. You and Tiresias sit just inside the doorway where the breeze carries a little of the night's chill, but none of the city's noise. A clay lamp flickers beside you, casting soft light across the floor. Tiresias is quiet, sipping a thin broth from a chipped cup. His snake curls near the hearth, unmoving except for the slow rhythm of its breath. You break the silence by asking about the underworld. You had not meant to? The question just came out. He lifts an eyebrow. That is quite the bedtime story. You begin to apologize, but he waves it off. No, it's fine, he says. Everyone is curious, even those who claim not to be. He sets his cup down gently, tapping one finger along its rim. It is not what you expect. No fire, no screaming, just silence. Too much of it. You lean forward. It is not punishment, he continues. It is waiting. So much waiting. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In Greek mythology, Tiresias is one of the few mortals granted permission to retain his consciousness after death. According to Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus seeks out Tiresias in the land of the dead to learn how to return home safely. Tiresias speaks clearly and confidently, unlike most shades, who appear vague and half-formed in death. You do not walk in the underworld, he says now. You remember yourself forward, like peeling back layers of fog. You ask what Odysseus was like when they met. Polite, Tiresias says. Tired. He carried a lot, and he wanted to be told he was right. You ask if he was. Tiresias smiles. Close enough, but not in the ways that mattered. Now for your quirky detail. A rarely cited fragment suggests that Tiresias grew irritated with Odysseus's many questions and finally told him to go home, bake some bread, and stop bothering ghosts. Historians still argue whether this detail was meant to be humorous or critical of Homer's endless heroic quests. The dead do not speak unless you ask, Tiresias says, and even then, they mostly just sigh. You ask what he means by waiting. They wait to be remembered, he says, to be named. That is all. Not revenge, not judgment, just recognition. You sit with that a moment. He rubs his hands together. They want to know that their small life meant something, that their words lasted longer than their bones. He stands slowly and steps toward the courtyard, where the shadows are long and the fig tree stands like a watchful old friend. You will not find terror there, he says, only faces, and most of them look confused. You follow him into the open air. He tilts his face up toward the stars, unseeing and yet still somehow observant. The most dangerous dead are the ones who die with questions. They cling to you. They follow your dreams. They whisper in your sleep. You ask if that has happened to him. He nods. Often. But they are not cruel. Just unfinished. You wonder what it means to finish a life. Not to be perfect, he says. Just to be understood. Once. Clearly. By someone. He turns back to the door. That is what they all wanted. Even Achilles. Even the cowherd who drowned in a ditch. Back inside, the lamp flickers again. The snake shifts. You sit in silence with him, the words lingering in the stillness. The underworld no longer feels like a pit, or a prison, but more like a waiting room full of voices longing to be heard one last time. The stars have thickened above, crowding the night sky like 1,000 curious eyes. Tiresias stands at the edge of the courtyard, listening, not to you, not to the wind, but to something farther off, something buried in silence. He gestures for you to join him and points upward. There, he says softly, that one's called the Liar's Crown. Not officially, of course. You glance up. The constellation he indicates is barely visible, a cluster of faint stars near the edge of the sky. Why the Liar's Crown, you ask? Because it always points the wrong way, he replies. Makes you think it leads north, but it turns you in circles. You chuckle. That sounds about right for the stars. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece, stars and constellations were not just markers of navigation, but were deeply woven into myth and prophecy. Seers often use the sky to predict seasonal changes, harvest times, and celestial omens. The stars were both map and message board for those who knew how to read them. Tiresias walks back toward the fig tree, slowly. They always ask about stars, he says. They want to know what the heavens are saying, but they never think to ask what they themselves are saying. He sits again, brushes dust from his robe. The stars do not lie, but they also do not care. You ask if he ever used the stars to guide his prophecies. No, he says. I use silence, patterns, the way people pause before a lie. You sit beside him as he reaches for a fig. But I used to tell people the stars told me, he admits. It comforted them. Now for your quirky detail. There is a forgotten myth that Tiresias once invented a constellation during a particularly dry summer, just to keep the villagers from panicking. He pointed at a patch of sky and claimed it was the jar of abundance, soon to be filled. A week later, it rained. The villagers never questioned him again. Historians still argue whether the story was divine coincidence or masterful misdirection. The thing about stars, he continues, is that they're always behind. We see them as they were, not as they are. You ask if that matters. Not really, he replies. Most people love what used to be more than what is. A cool breeze passes through the courtyard. Somewhere nearby, an owl hoots. Tiresias tilts his head toward it. He's late tonight, he says. You look around. Who? The owl, he says plainly. He comes to complain about mice. Every few nights. I think he just likes to hear himself speak. You smile. The owl hoots again. It does sound a bit dramatic. The sky tells stories, Tiresias says, but only if you already know how to listen. You ask if he has a favorite constellation. He points again. That one looks like a crooked staff. It is not famous, but it reminds me of mine. The stars shimmer faintly, barely disturbed by the night's breeze. You find yourself breathing more slowly, thoughts softening like fabric left out in the sun. You know what the stars cannot predict? He asks. When someone will finally stop asking questions and just sit quietly. You grin. Is that a hint? He shrugs. Maybe. You both sit in the stillness, side by side, the fig tree casting long shadows under moonlight. The owl takes flight, wings brushing the air with a quiet sweep, and Tiresias closes his eyes, not to sleep, but simply to rest in a night where, for once, no one needs answers. The next morning arrives in pieces, a soft clang of a pot lid, the distant bleat of a goat, the light slipping across the floor like it is trying not to wake anyone. You rise slowly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the day, only to find Tiresias already awake, already dressed, already stirring something in a clay bowl with a stick that is definitely not meant for cooking. He pauses, sniffs the bowl, then grimaces. This was supposed to be soup. It has become something else. You offer to start again. He waves you off. No, I like surprises, even terrible ones. You smile, but his face is serious. Thebes is quiet today, he says, which means someone is planning something. He sits with the bowl anyway, poking at it between sips of water. You hear footsteps outside, light ones, hesitant. A visitor. Tiresias tilts his head before they knock. She has soft sandals, he says. She does not want to be heard. A knock at the door. A young woman enters. She bows too deeply, hands shaking slightly. You offer her a seat. Tiresias simply waits. My name is Althea, she says. I think I am cursed. He nods once. Everyone is. But let us narrow it down. She explains. Strange dreams. A string of failed harvests. Her animals avoid her. Her neighbors whisper. One claims she spoke ill of Artemis without knowing. Another says her shadow moves differently than her body. Tiresias listens without interruption. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece, being cursed was not always associated with punishment or sin. It often meant falling out of favor with a god, stepping outside a ritual, or simply existing in a time and place that made people uneasy. Women especially were susceptible to accusations of spiritual contamination during times of misfortune. Tiresias holds out his hand. She hesitates, then takes it. He does not examine her palm or chant anything mysterious. He just listens again, to the tremble in her breath, the way her fingers twitch. The moment she tries not to cry, then he says, "You are not cursed. You are exhausted?" She blinks. "You have been carrying too many things that are not yours," he continues. "You are the scapegoat for other people's fear. That is not a curse. That is habit." She does cry then, quietly. The tears slip down her cheeks and land on her tunic. You fetch her a cup of water. Tiresias remains still. "You need rest," he says gently, "and someone to tell you that you are not broken." She wipes her eyes, thanks him, and leaves without asking for more. She walks differently on the way out. Lighter, maybe, or at least more grounded. Now for your quirky detail. There is a lesser-known story in which Tiresias supposedly removed a curse not through ritual, but by making a woman laugh. He told her a ridiculous story about Apollo's missing sandal and a goat that ran a temple for 3 days. She laughed so hard she dropped her offering bowl. From that day on, her troubles ceased. Historians still argue whether the laughter cured her, or if the goat was somehow involved. Tiresias sits quietly for a long while after Althea leaves. You offer him the soup again. He tastes it, winces, then finishes it anyway. "She will be fine," he says. "She just needed permission to stop pretending." You ask if that is all a curse really is. "Sometimes," he says. "Other times it is a goat that knows too much." The day moves forward. The wind rustles the fig tree. You sweep the floor. The snake naps in a warm patch of light. Tiresias listens to the quiet and finds in it something that feels almost like peace. Midday stretches across Thebes like a tired yawn. The air is thick and dry, the kind that makes you want to nap but also makes sleep impossible. Tiresias sits near the window with a damp cloth on his neck and a jug of water resting at his feet. He does not move much, except to shoo a fly that insists on orbiting his ear. "I've been thinking about transformation," he says suddenly, as if a fly reminded him. "Not metaphorical ones, real ones." You raise an eyebrow. That usually means he is about to tell a story that will leave you wide-eyed and mildly uncomfortable. "Most people think change comes slowly," he says, "that it's gentle. But real transformation feels like being dropped into someone else's life." He leans back, one hand resting on the windowsill. "Take me, for example. I was not always the way I am now. I lived as a man, then a woman, then a man again. You'd think that would earn me a little patience from the gods." You blink. He does not elaborate yet, but the weight of that sentence sinks deep. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Tiresias is one of the only figures in Greek mythology who lived as both a man and a woman. According to myth, he was transformed into a woman after striking to mating snakes with a stick. He lived as a woman for 7 years, even marrying and bearing children, before being transformed back into a man after encountering the same snakes again. "They asked me once who had more pleasure in love," he says, "not looking at you, men or women." The gods were arguing again, as they often do. Zeus said women. Hera said men. You ask what he answered? "I said women." "Of course," he says. "Hera blinded me." You stare at him. "Because of that." He shrugs. Truth makes people angry. Now for your quirky detail. One version of the myth claims that after being transformed into a woman, Tiresias became a priestess of Hera and was known for dancing at festivals while wearing gold bangles and red sandals. Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic detail or an actual tradition passed down in whispers. He wipes sweat from his brow and grins. "They gave me prophecy as a consolation prize. I lost my eyes and gained 1,000 headaches." You sit beside him, both of you squinting at the sunlit courtyard. "You learn a lot when you walk in different shoes," he says. "Literally and otherwise. People speak differently to you, touch your arm differently, doubt you for different reasons." He taps his staff against the stone floor. "And yet, at the end of the day, they all ask the same thing. Am I loved?" The jug of water is nearly empty. You refill it. Tiresias accepts it gratefully. "It was not a punishment," he says after a long pause. "It was a lesson. The gods are good at those." You ask if he missed anything during those years as a woman. He chuckles. "I miss pants that fit properly, and not being asked to explain my every decision." You grin. "Did you like being a woman?" He smiles. "I like being me." The rest was just wardrobe. Outside, the wind picks up, rustling the fig leaves into a soft applause. Tiresias tilts his head toward it. Everything changes, he says, even when people pretend it doesn't. And for a while, you both sit in silence, listening to the world shifting gently, endlessly around you. The evening settles in like a soft sigh. The wind dies down. The last of the market stalls are being packed away with the quiet clink of jars and the occasional muttered complaint about spoiled dates or someone forgetting their change. Tiresias stirs from his seat beside the fig tree, where he's been resting with his eyes closed for the better part of an hour. He opens one eye and says, "You know what no one wants, a prophecy that actually tells the truth." You raise an eyebrow, but you already know this is not a question. He is going to explain whether you're ready or not. They come to me and say, "Great seer, tell me what's ahead." And I do. I say, "Your son will betray you. Your crops will fail. Your neighbor will run off with your wine cellar." And they always blink and say, "Can you make it nicer?" He reaches for a handful of dried figs and begins to chew thoughtfully. "I am not a poet," he says through a mouthful. "I do not add ribbons to disaster. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Throughout Greek mythology and literature, seers like Tiresias often foretold unpleasant truths. They were not advisors in the modern sense, meant to soften blows or offer comfort. They were interpreters of divine will and natural consequence. Their role was not to make life easier, but to help others prepare for the worst." Tiresias wipes his hands on his robe and chuckles. "I once told a mother her child would live a short but glorious life. She cried. I asked if she would prefer a long and boring one. You ask if she ever thanked him. She sent me pickled onions for years. I assume that was gratitude. Now for your quirky detail." One story tells of Tiresias giving a prophecy so vague it was later painted on a public wall as a joke. It read, "What you seek will arrive, but not on the day you expect, nor in the form you recognize." A farmer took this to mean his missing goat would return. When it didn't, he accused the seer of fraud. 2 years later, the man found a completely different goat and declared the prophecy fulfilled. Historians still argue whether this was satire or accidental accuracy. They want stories, Tiresias says. They want the fates to sound like bedtime tales. But sometimes fate is just a cart with a broken wheel. You offer him more figs. He waves them off. Too sweet. Makes the truth taste bitter afterward. He leans his staff against the bench and stretches his legs. "I once told a king that peace was coming. He threw a feast. Then I added, after your son dies, the feast ended early. You ask if he ever lies to soften the blow. He considers. Not lies. Edits. Strategic phrasing. A little pause here. A change of tone there. You grin. So, like telling a child they have a surprise, but not saying it's a dentist appointment." He smiles. "Exactly." The snake rustles nearby, moving through the grass with a faint whisper of scales. Tiresias listens. "Even the snake knows," he says. "Sometimes the path is crooked on purpose." You sit quietly together as the stars blink into view. No chorus, no shouts, no neighbors today, just the two of you and the deep, thoughtful hush of night. "You know," he says, "people think a prophecy should save them, but really, it just gives them a choice, whether they walk toward it or away." And you begin to understand, perhaps more clearly than before, that Tiresias does not speak to control the future. He speaks so that others might finally see the present. The house is quiet, too quiet. You step softly across the cool stone floor, half expecting Tiresias to be where he always is, by the fig tree, near the courtyard, maybe humming to himself or pretending to be asleep just to avoid conversation. But this morning, he is not in his usual spot, nor is he near the hearth. You find him eventually, seated beside the basin, staring into water that reflects only sky. "I was remembering," he says without turning, "things I saw that no one else believed." You crouch beside him. The water is still. A single leaf floats at the surface, unbothered by time or movement. "There was once a woman who spoke to ghosts," he says. "Not in riddles, not with spells. She just listened. Everyone thought she was mad. I thought she was peaceful." You ask what happened to her. She married a fisherman, he says, lived quietly, then one day she stopped speaking entirely. I think she finally heard something she didn't want to. He trails his fingers through the water. People think hearing is a gift. It is also a burden. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greek culture, seers like Tiresias were believed to communicate not only with the gods, but also with the spirits of the dead. The Nikia, the rite performed by Odysseus to summon spirits in the underworld, shows that listening to the dead was considered sacred, but also dangerous. What one hears, one cannot unhear. Tiresias pulls his hand back from the basin and dries it on his robe. The worst voices, he murmurs, are not the loud ones. They are the ones that speak in your sleep. You offer to fetch bread. He waves it off. Not yet. I'm not hungry for anything that can be chewed. Now for your quirky detail. A lost myth fragment once claimed that Tiresias learned to hear the voices of the dead while napping beneath a tree struck by lightning. The wind from the tree carried whispers, and ever since, he could not sleep in silence. Historians still argue whether this was meant as metaphor or a poetic origin story for his second sight. I once heard a child laugh in a dream, he says, and woke up crying, not because it was sad, because I knew I would never hear it again. You sit beside him in the stillness. The courtyard is empty. Even the snake seems to have taken the day off. Tiresias leans back slowly, rests his head against the wall. Everyone imagines prophecy like thunder, like a booming voice from the sky. But it is more like a whisper through dry grass. If you do not sit still, you miss it. You think of the city beyond the walls, the streets filling with noise, people seeking answers. But here, the only sound is the soft splash of a leaf bumping gently against the basin's edge. Do you want to know what I really see? He asks. You nod. I see possibilities. Roads curling off into fog. One step changes everything. Most people walk in circles without knowing. He shifts his foot slightly, nudging a stone. Sometimes I tell them the truth. Sometimes I tell them the better lie. You ask which is kinder. That depends, he says, on whether they're asking out of fear or hope. The sun warms the edge of the courtyard. You hear a lark call, sharp and sudden. Tiresias tilts his head toward the sound. I told a lark once that it sang off-key. He mutters. It did not return for a week. You smile. He does not. It's not easy, being the one who sees, he says. But it is far worse to be the one who almost did. The wind returns. Light and dry. It rustles the fig leaves, stirs the basin water. Tiresias closes his eyes, and for a while, he listens. Late in the afternoon, Tiresias decides it is time to walk again. No destination, no errands, just the slow meandering of someone who has spent too long sitting and needs to hear his staff on the stones to remember where he is. You walk with him? Of course. By now it feels odd to walk without him, as if your own steps would somehow lose their rhythm. Thebes stretches out ahead, dustier than usual, and humming with the familiar chorus of shouting, laughter, carts, and sandals. A pot clinks against a wall. A goat refuses to be moved. Somewhere, a child is reciting something very fast and very wrong. Tiresias listens to it all without complaint, then says, people think fate is a straight line. It's really more like a goat path, worn by accident and regretted immediately. You pass a group of young men playing dice in the shade. One calls out, Hey old man, tell us who wins. Tiresias does not break stride. The one who cheats, he says calmly. Laughter trails behind you, then a faint argument about who has been cheating this whole time. They want luck, he says. But they forget luck has very sharp teeth. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Gambling was common in ancient Greece, and seers were often asked to bless games or predict outcomes. Dice made from bones or stones were popular among soldiers, merchants, and anyone who thought the gods might be persuaded to favor them, and thus this once. Tiresias stops suddenly beside a small fig vendor and lifts his chin. This man smells like a lie, he murmurs. You glance at the vendor, who is loudly proclaiming his fruit to be the sweetest in all of Boeotia. The figs are shriveled and clearly bruised. He sniffs again. Also vinegar, possibly his soul. Now for your quirky detail. A nearly forgotten tale tells of Tiresias once winning a chariot in a dice game, not because he played, but because he correctly guessed how every player would lie about their role. He gifted the chariot to a priest who had no horse. Historians still argue whether this happened or if it was a metaphor for Tiresias' knack for seeing past luck into character. You continue through the street. A woman selling linens nods politely. A boy with a basket of herbs stumbles beside you and drops a handful of thyme. Tiresias steps over it without comment. What's the use of knowing the future, he says suddenly, if no one changes because of it? You ask him what he means. I told a man he would lose his daughter if he rode to war. He went anyway. She died. He returned and said I had not been clear enough. You walk in silence for a while. The fig tree near the temple gate is blooming again. Tiresias turns his head toward it, sniffing the air. Everything repeats, he says. Even the blooms, even the mistakes. You ask why he still tells people the truth, knowing they will ignore it. Because someone always listens, he says. Not right away, but later. In the dark, when it's quiet. The road curves uphill, and you help him navigate a few loose stones. His steps are careful, but confident. Once, I told a thief he would find redemption, he says. He cried, not because he believed me, but because no one had ever used that word with him. You ask if the thief changed. Tiresias shrugs. He returned a stolen bull. It's a start. The sun begins to drop lower, and the rooftops stretch their shadows across the street. You turn back toward home. I like walking, he says. The world speaks more when you are not trying to command it, and you realize, as the fig trees whisper and the air thickens with early evening, that Tiresias does not walk to reach somewhere. He walks to hear what the road has been trying to say. The sun begins its slow descent behind the western hills, painting Thebes in golden light that clings to rooftops and filters through fig leaves in long, sleepy stripes. You and Tiresias return home slowly. His steps are even, but quieter than usual, like his mind is wandering farther than his feet. He settles beside the doorway without a word. The snake curls near his feet. You bring him a small piece of bread and a jug of cool water. He accepts both with a nod, but does not speak until the bread is nearly gone. People always ask me if the gods are watching, he says, brushing crumbs from his robe. They are, but only when bored. You smile. So, most of the time then? He chuckles. Precisely. The light shifts again. The courtyard warms with the quiet of late day, when even the birds seem to murmur instead of sing. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In the stories passed down through Greek myth, the gods were often depicted as both omniscient and distractible. They watched humans like a child might watch ants, fascinated for a moment, then easily diverted by a brighter thread. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, all had their moments of divine attention, but rarely for long. They like spectacle. Tiresias says, war, betrayal, passion, but quiet joy, that they skip. You ask if he has ever seen them lose interest mid-tragedy. Oh yes, he says. They once turned away from a royal scandal because a goat gave birth to twins. You stare. Was that significant? He shrugs. Only to the goat. But Hera was very taken with it. Now for your quirky detail. There's a forgotten tale which Tiresias claimed that Hermes once appeared mid-prophecy, just to borrow a spoon. According to the myth, he had a stew going and needed something to stir it. He vanished before the prophecy could be finished. Historians still argue whether this was divine mischief or just a humorous parable about the fickleness of gods. The thing is, Tiresias says, humans think they want the gods' attention, but most of the time, it ends poorly. He leans forward, hands folded. They want miracles. They forget miracles are usually loud, disruptive, and come with unexpected side effects. You ask if he has ever asked the gods for anything. He nods. Once. I asked to forget something. You wait. He does not elaborate. After a long moment, he adds, they said no. The breeze stirs the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a child's laughter rises, followed by the clatter of a dropped bucket. Mortals are small, he says, but noisy. That is why the gods keep glancing down. It is like living above a theater. You ignore it until someone yells. He chuckles softly. and someone is always yelling. You sit together as the shadows lengthen. The stone floor cools beneath you. Tiresias taps his staff against the ground once, a soft rhythm to keep his thoughts moving. They ask me if the gods are kind, he says. I tell them the gods are interested, and that is often more dangerous. You ask if the gods ever truly help anyone. Sometimes, he says, but usually by accident. The light fades. The city begins to soften. Thebes winds down, but never quite rests. Not entirely. Tiresias stands slowly, brushes the dust from his robe, and stretches. I think they listen, he says, but only when the story gets good, and you both step inside, leaving the gods to their distant watchfulness and the stars to blink on, one by one, without fanfare. Night falls with purpose, not rushed, not slow, just inevitable. Thebes softens under the weight of it. The air cools, the stones release the last of the day's heat, and the fig tree begins to rustle more than it did under the sun. Tiresias moves more slowly now. His energy wanes at this hour, though he never admits it. You bring a cushion for his seat and a bowl of water to soak his feet. He accepts both with a quiet hum, neither grateful nor indifferent, just present. You know what I miss? He asks after a long silence. Cooking for people. This surprises you. You cooked. Poorly, he says, but enthusiastically. He chuckles. There was a season when I lived near the temple of Demeter. The priestesses thought I was some strange, wandering baker. I made barley cakes that could chip a tooth, but no one said anything. They were too polite. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Food was central to Greek ritual and daily life, not only as sustenance, but as a sacred act. Meals were offerings, celebrations, symbols of community. Even oracles and seers participated in these traditions. Prophets like Tiresias were often given food in exchange for wisdom, and many lived in or near temples where ritual meals were shared regularly. Tiresias shifts, dipping one foot in the bowl and sighing at the relief. I once tried to make honeyed wine for a festival. Used vinegar by accident. The high priest declared it divine punishment. I never corrected him. You grin. Did anyone drink it? To men, he says. They propose to each other by nightfall. No regrets. Now for your quirky detail. A minor tradition claims that Tiresias once judged a village cooking contest using only his sense of smell and touch. He declared the winner based on the texture of a lentil stew and the way steam curled from a roast. The loser accused him of favoritism and was promptly outvoted by 3 grandmothers and a goat. Historians still argue whether this event occurred or was invented to explain an annual festival held in his name. He rests his arms on the edge of the basin. The problem with prophecy, he says, is that it pulls you away from the present. But food keeps you here. Now, you ask what his favorite meal was. He smiles. Bread. Warm. With herbs. Simple. Honest. You think about that. Bread does not demand much, but it offers everything. He dries his feet and leans back against the stone. The snake curls nearby, quiet and content. They want the future to be like a feast, he says, laid out in full. No surprises, but the future is more like a simmering pot. You have to wait, stir it, smell it, hope it doesn't burn. The lamp flickers near the hearth. You light another and place it closer to the wall. Tiresias speaks again, voice slower now. Sometimes I think about making cakes again, just to see if I remember. You tell him you would eat whatever he made, even if it cracked your teeth. He asks, raising an eyebrow. You nod, especially then. He laughs, a soft, full sound that warms the whole room. For a moment, he says nothing, just breathes, just listens to the stillness. Maybe that's all prophecy is, he murmurs. The scent of something cooking before it's ready. And the night, rich with stories and silence, continues on. The night is darker now, that thick, velvet dark that seems to soften the edges of things. Lamps glow like stars trapped in clay, and the sky above Thebes is a quiet sea of scattered lights. Tiresias sits in his usual spot, but tonight he has pulled his cloak tighter, not because of the cold, but for the weight of memory. He turns to you suddenly. Have I told you about the time someone tried to steal my staff? You shake your head. It was a young man, bold, or foolish, possibly both. He waited until I was speaking to a merchant and thought I would not notice. He lifts the staff now, resting across his lap. The problem was, he did not know the staff talks. You blink. The staff talks. Tiresias smirks. Not out loud, but it remembers. The weight, the balance, the way the wood shifts in your hand. The moment someone else held it, I knew. He leans forward slightly. I turned and said, "It doesn't like you." The boy dropped it, ran off, never came back. You laugh, imagining the scene. Here is your mainstream historical fact. A prophet's staff was not just a walking stick. In ancient Greece, it symbolized wisdom, authority, and the connection between seer and sacred insight. Often carved from specific woods and sometimes marked with symbols, the staff served as both tool and emblem of power. To touch a seer's staff without permission was considered deeply disrespectful. Tiresias traces his fingers along the grain of the wood. It has been with me longer than any person, seen more cities than some generals, heard more confessions than most priests. He rests it beside him gently, like placing a friend into sleep. Now for your quirky detail. There is an old story about Tiresias' staff once being mistaken for a sacred relic by a group of wandering monks. They tried to enshrine it in a temple. When he found out, Tiresias simply walked in, took it back, and said, "You can worship it if you like, but I needed to stir my stew." Historians still argue whether this anecdote was meant to honor his humility or mock the monks. You watch him now, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. Do you ever wish you could pass the staff to someone else? You ask. He shakes his head slowly. It wouldn't work. Prophecy is not inherited. It's endured. You think about that. All the years he has carried it. All the visions. All the truths no one wanted. And still he holds it. Not tightly, but firmly. I once dropped it during an earthquake, he says. It rolled into a fountain. I almost let it go. You ask what stopped him. I remembered a woman once told me I would die holding it. I thought, better not test her timing. He chuckles softly. The snake shifts slightly at his feet. The lamps burn lower. Even the fig tree seems to droop, as if weary from its own memories. The staff has never lied to me. Tiresias says, people have, the gods have, but not this. He stands slowly, using it to rise. It does not speak, but it steadies. And you see now that this is more than an object. It is his story, carved in wood, a silent companion through wars, myths, questions, and dreams. He walks to the doorway and leans on the frame. You do not choose to be a seer, he says, but you do choose what you carry. And tonight, as he rests his staff beside the door, he chooses peace. Dawn is still a promise, not a fact. The sky holds a faint grayness, like a curtain just about to rise. Thebes remains asleep. Mostly, a few early carts creak in the distance. Someone coughs, far off. But here, in this small corner of the city, all is still. Tiresias is awake? Of course. He always is before the sun. He sits beside the cold hearth, running his fingers along the rim of a bowl he has not touched. You offer him warm water. He takes it without looking up. I dreamed of birds, he says quietly, but they had no wings. You wait. He sometimes speaks like this at first light, the dream world still clinging to him like a veil. They walked, he says, thousands of them, across a field, heads tilted, silent. You ask what it meant? He shakes his head. That sometimes the things we believe can fly choose not to? You both sip in silence, the air cool and damp with the breath of coming day. Here is your mainstream historical fact. In Greek antiquity, dreams were often considered messages from the gods, particularly from Apollo, who governed both plague and prophecy. Seers interpreted these dreams, but they were rarely straightforward. Symbolism ruled. A bird might mean freedom, or a coming journey, or simply that someone had forgotten to shut the hen house. Tiresias places the bowl down gently. They want their dreams interpreted, he says, but most of them already know what they mean. You ask why they still come to him. Then, he shrugs. It is easier to pretend the answer is hidden than to accept it is already known. Now for your quirky detail. There is a local folktale that Tiresias once interpreted a dream involving a fish with legs chasing a senator. His advice was to stop borrowing money from suspicious sailors. The dreamer laughed, ignored him, and was promptly fined by the port authority for illegal fishing. Historians still argue whether Tiresias truly dreamt the fish or if the story is a joke about bureaucratic karma. Dreams are not warnings, he says. They are mirrors, slightly cracked, often too honest. You nod, and he reaches for his staff, rising slowly. I told a man his dream of drowning was not about death, he says. It was about asking for help and no one hearing him. You ask what the man did? He moved to a quieter village. Tiresias says, started teaching children how to swim. The street beyond the gate brightens. A rooster calls out, bored with waiting. Thebes begins to stretch and yawn, unaware of the small truths already rising with the day. Tiresias steps into the courtyard, tilting his head toward the sky. They think dreams are nonsense, he says, but they forget that nonsense speaks with fewer lies. The fig tree shakes slightly as a breeze passes. You hear the first real clatter of feet against stone. The city wakes. Tiresias does not turn toward it. He simply stands still, staff in hand, as though listening for the last notes of a fading melody. He sighs, deeply, but without sorrow. The hardest thing, he says, is not dreaming. It's returning to the world afterward. And then, slowly, you both begin the walk back into morning. The morning light glimmers across the tiles like spilled milk and honey, slow and golden. Tiresias sits just outside the doorway, his feet stretched toward a warming patch of sun. Thebes hums beyond the courtyard walls, but here, it's as though the world has paused, just for a little while. You hand him a fresh fig, and he accepts it with a small grunt of appreciation. He turns it in his fingers, inspecting it as if it might speak. I remember a fig tree that grew sideways, he says, on a cliff near Delphi. Everyone said it was cursed. I said it was clever. He bites into the fig, chews slowly. It got more sun that way. You smile. So, it wasn't cursed. No, he says, just unwilling to grow like the others. Here is your mainstream historical fact. Delphi, home to the famous Oracle of Apollo, was the spiritual center of the ancient Greek world. Seers, including Tiresias on rare occasions, were known to travel there to consult or offer counsel. But not all oracles sat in temples. Many delivered their visions from gardens, caves, crossroads, or even under trees. The divine was not picky about scenery. Tiresias tosses the fig stem aside. People like to believe truth must come from marble halls and golden bulls. They forget that most truths arrive barefoot, with dirt on their knees. You ask if he ever visited the Oracle of Delphi. He nods. Once. She asks me what I saw. I told her I saw a woman pretending not to know the answer. You laugh. Did she say anything back? She said, good. That makes two of us. Now for your quirky detail. One surviving account suggests that the oracles at Delphi respected Tiresias not because of his visions, but because he once beat the head priestess at a game of knucklebones. She supposedly declared, if he sees the future as well as he sees a winning throw, let him speak. Historians still argue whether the story is true or simply a way to humanize two of the most revered seers in Greek myth. Tiresias brushes crumbs from his robe. They keep asking if I regret anything, he says, as though regret is a coin you can spend to change things. You ask if he has any regrets. I regret not keeping the chariot, he says. It would have annoyed so many important people. You both laugh. The snake curls around a sun-warmed stone and flicks its tongue lazily into the air. The thing about being Tiresias, he says, voice softer now, is that I always arrive too early or too late. Never quite at the moment they want. You tilt your head. Is that because of the gift? He nods. The gift, the curse, the habit, whatever name they give it. He leans back against the stone wall, eyes half closed. I have spoken to kings who could not hear me, and to beggars who listened too well. In the end, only one question remains. You wait. Did anyone carry the truth with them? Or did they leave it where I dropped it? Thebes continues around you. The clatter of sandals, the bray of a stubborn mule, the faint clang of copper pots meeting cobblestones. But here, with Tiresias, the day has not truly begun. It simply breathes. He smiles at nothing in particular. You know what I think the gods enjoy most? He asks. You lean closer, watching us guess, and then he rests his head against the warm stone and closes his eyes. You do not speak. You sit beside him, staff resting nearby, the fig tree casting its dappled shade, and you let the moment be exactly what it is, unfinished, unhurried, and quietly whole. So now, as the day winds softly down and your thoughts begin to settle like dust on a quiet windowsill, you let yourself drift with the gentle rhythm of Tiresias' world. The sounds of Thebes have faded into background hush. The fig leaves rustle with just enough effort to remind you that time is still passing, but without any pressure, without any rush. The prophet is quiet now. The snake sleeps in a patch of golden light. The staff leans where he left it. All the questions about gods and mortals and dreams have been asked. Some were answered, some were not, but none of them demand anything from you now. You breathe in slowly, let it stretch gently through your body. Let it ease into your shoulders, your arms, your jaw. Feel how still everything has become, how calm, how soft. Maybe you picture the streets of Thebes at night, the winding paths, the crooked tiles, the fig vendor packing up his wares while muttering to himself. Maybe you see Tiresias sitting by the hearth, smiling faintly at something only he can hear. Or maybe you simply feel the quiet, and that is enough. Let the noise of today drop away. Let it settle behind you like a door being closed, gently and with care. You are not expected to see the future. You are only asked to rest, to soften into stillness, to listen, not to prophecy, but to peace. You have arrived at the quiet part of the story, and you are exactly where you need to be. Good night.